welcome. Thank you for taking your lunchtime to being with us today. We want to welcome all of you to Rice University, and for those of you not from Houston, we want to welcome you to our great city. Now, usually I get an introduction, but apparently, finally, my staff has concluded I really don't deserve an introduction. So I'm going to spare you that. But a year ago, our city suffered what has been regarded as really one of the worst, if not the worst, natural disaster in our state's history. And so many of our fellow citizens of Houston, Harris County, the metropolitan area, our neighboring county, suffered terrible losses and really continue to suffer in many ways. And yet, at the same time, I think we've been impressed by the spirit of our people, both the resilience of the people affected and the generous spirit of so many who have supported them. Here at Rice, more than 1,700 students out of our comparatively small student body volunteered to go out and help members of the community. We made grants to do research, to understand exactly what was happening in lots of different ways across the city. We provided financial assistance to our own faculty and staff who suffered immediate losses. And we tried to really live what we like to call at Rice, our culture of care. Now, 1 year later, it's not exactly a time for what I would say a celebration, but it is a time to pause and ask the question, how are we doing? And we ask that question in two different senses. We ask it on behalf of the people who suffered terribly as a result of Hurricane Harvey, and how are they doing? And they are we as part of our community. How are the members of our community doing? What still remains to be done? But we ask that question also in terms of ourselves and our institutions and our governments, our city government and our state government and our county government and our federal government that takes a shared responsibility in times of disaster, and that's one of the purposes, really, of the event today. This is hosted here at the Glasscock School of Continuing Studies. For Rice, people used to say Rice was kind of a hidden gem, sat behind the hedges. We've been very clear about our strategy, and our strategy is to engage with the city of Houston. We've just developed a new strategic plan, and we continue to have as our strategy engaging with the city of Houston. But more than that, we've sort of enlarged that strategy, not merely to engage with the city of Houston, but to empower the city of Houston, to take a very active approach to how we can contribute to that. And no part of our university is more important than the Glasscock School of Continuing Studies in carrying out that mission of our university, not only to provide education across a wide range of topics, to expand literally the footprint of our university by tens of thousands of students, but also to convene conversations like this. So again, I want to welcome all of you here. We are honored to be able to host this event, and it's now my great pleasure to introduce our Dean of the Glasscock School of Continuing Studies, Rob Bruce.
Thank you, President Lebron, and thanks to everyone for being here. I will echo the good afternoon, and it's great to see everyone. You know, I've been here for about 10 months, and therein lies a very short story. And I guess everyone has a story surrounding Harvey. So here's mine. I arrived after the storm, but the backstory to that is on August the 25th, I'm in a conversation with Provost Marilyn Miranda, who happens to be sitting over there and just waved. I'm in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and I've interviewed a couple of times, and my family and I, we're considering making the move. A couple of days or an evening passes, and Provost Miranda contacts me and says, cancel your plans for your visit. This storm is going to be bad. So we watched over the next couple of weeks. We eventually flew down, and we saw the city and the devastation. But we also saw the city already starting to recover. So imagine this is 2 weeks afterwards. My wife and I, over the next few weeks, started doing research. We learned everything we could. We educated ourselves on floodplains and development and zoning and hurricanes. And I would say that we continue to educate ourselves, and that's why I'm very pleased to join with the Tribune, to welcome the panel today, and personally to have this type of educational experience. President Lebron referenced the Suzanne M. Glasscock School of Continuing Studies and what it is that we do. And it is our charge, it is our primary mission to extend Rice, to engage Houston, to expand access. And so I'm very pleased to be here today to continue that education process. I did want to, I know we had a little bit of information out there, perhaps some of you picked up our catalog, but I wanted to call your attention to one specific series that we have upcoming. Starting September the 27th, we will run an 8-week series. It will be every Thursday evening, I believe from 7 to 8:30, and it is on Harvey after the flood. We will have Rice University experts. We will have experts from around the city, and they will discuss their research and strategies of resiliency. And it's not just involving Houston. It's really looking at areas around the globe. So if you haven't picked up that information, I invite you to pick that up, to look at our website. You can email me, and we can have a conversation about it. I want to thank President Lebron again for being here, Provost Marilyn Miranda. I want to thank the Tribune staff and the Glasscock team for helping coordinate this event. Certainly the panelists, thanks again for being here. We're pleased to host the program, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brandon Formby, the moderator. Brandon is the Tribune's urban affairs reporter. He researches and writes about the challenges of the largest metro areas in Texas. Sounds very appropriate. Thanks for being here, everyone.
Yes, thank you to President Lebron, Dean Bruce, and to the Rice University Glasscock School of Continuing Studies for hosting us. We also want to thank Nathan Cook, Sarah Cooper, and Nicole Estrada for help in organizing the event. And we actually have a lot of sponsors for the event today that I would like to thank real quick, and that's the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, Laura and John Arnold, the Texas Association of School Business Officials, Centerpoint Energy, Anheuser-Busch, Fibertown, Amazon Web Services, Texas Municipal League, the Hackett Center for Mental Health, Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas, Southwest Airlines, the Houston Endowment, the George and Cynthia Mitchell Foundation, the Brown Foundation, and our media partner, the Victoria Advocate. Though donors and sponsors underwrite our events, they play no role in determining the content, the panelists, or the line of questioning. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan digital news organization that covers statewide politics and policy issues in Texas, and we're supported by members, many of which are here today, and we thank you. Also, at this time, if you haven't already, please silence your cell phones. And if you are going to tweet or Facebook, we ask that you use the hashtag TTEvents. The event is supposed to last until 1 p.m. We do want to get you out of here by 1 p.m. But toward the end, we'll have a 15-minute Q&A session where members of the audience can approach the microphones and ask the panelists things that haven't been answered yet. And with that, I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists. To my direct left here, we have Marvin Odum, who is the Chief Recovery Officer for the City of Houston. To his left is Land Commissioner George P. Bush with the Texas General Land Office. To his left, we have Traci Brasher, the Recovery Division Director for FEMA Region 6. And to her left, we have Beth Van Dyne, the Regional Administrator for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. It has been just a little bit over a year since Harvey hit, and to just kind of get a few key underlining things out of the way to kind of explain the different roles that these different agencies and people play is FEMA is typically the federal agency that comes in right after a storm. Their job is to help people who are in immediate danger and to start providing short-term housing assistance. Typically, that's things like hotel vouchers, trailers, like temporary repairs to homes, just to get people in a safe living environment. The General Land Office, for the first time ever, this is the first time that in the continental U.S. that a state agency has done this, took over some of those short-term housing programs to help people get into their houses quicker or temporary housing faster. And it also oversees the long-term recovery. And long-term recovery is rebuilding bridges, rebuilding neighborhoods, rebuilding public housing, helping people, replace a house that was totally lost. And the funds for that come from housing and urban development. It's Congress that appropriates those funds, but it flows through HUD. And then on a more local level, you have people like Mr. Odum here who kind of coordinate all of this and talk to or get information from people on the ground to kind of identify where the need is. So with that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and start with you, Ms. Brasher, and ask you, FEMA has a lot of experience dealing with disasters. How was Harvey different?
Well, I think for us, responses at times overwhelm not only local authorities, but states and federal agencies. And so we deployed over 17,000 people in initial support to Harvey, and that included the use and expanded use of our federal surge support staff from other federal agencies outside of FEMA. And we trained them just in time, and we put them out into our disaster recovery centers on the ground with our disaster survivors assistance, interviewing survivors, assisting survivors in registering for FEMA assistance. And then with also the hurricanes after with Maria and Irma, we've deployed over 85% of our federal workforce from FEMA just to support those 3 hurricanes. So it has been an extremely large event, and of course recovery is extremely long term. So we have had people deployed to these events for 1 year, which consistently happens sometimes, but we are now looking at switching people between events because we have what's called a 50-week rule. And so you'll see many people who have been supporting Harvey, unfortunately having to go to another event and people from that event coming to Harvey. So we can't stay in one location under per diem and lodging for more than 50 weeks. And so with these large of events, we're certainly looking at the way that we staff incidents like this in the future to make sure that we're more prepared to do that. And of course, with this event, Harvey was so large and recovery will take so long, we've opened a Texas recovery office in Austin, and we do have a branch office here in Houston, and those look to be long-term offices for at least the next 4 years to focus on the recovery of Hurricane Harvey.
What was the thinking behind turning a lot of the short-term programs over to the GLO? And given the size of Harvey, why did you use a storm this big to kind of test that new approach?
I think the first thing that was acknowledged by the administrator and others is that this was going to be a very large, overwhelming event, and then especially with the other hurricanes. And so we have had some discussions previously about a FEMA-funded, state-administered housing program. And so through our discussions with the governor's office and the Division of Emergency Management and others, the state opted to try that. There's obviously lessons learned and some hurdles when you try something for the first time, especially in the middle of an event. But the General Land Office certainly stepped up and worked in partnership with us to develop what was an intergovernmental services agreement because we do not have grant authority under our housing program. So we entered into a contract with the GLO and used that as our first kind of test case of implementing this housing where we funded it and they administered it, and it ended up really being a joint mission which helped us to get the housing out as quickly as we possibly could. And we're certainly in coordination and partnership with identifying some lessons learned from that and looking at working with some of our other state partners as well who are now interested in doing state administered housing so that in the future prior to a disaster, we would have the terms of that agreement and the implementation plans completed in advance.
Commissioner, it was about 3 weeks after the storm that your office was tapped, and I think you got a heads up the day of or the day before that y'all were going to be doing this, like right around the same time that the governor publicly announced it. Do you feel like you should have been given more of a heads up, and do you feel like that determination should have been made faster than 3 weeks after the storm?
Well, I'll never forget it, actually. We were mucking and gutting a home with Team Rubicon just in Dickinson, Texas, in anticipation of taking on what we traditionally do in partnership with HUD, and that's the long-term housing recovery, as you alluded to before, and got the call. There are many that kind of question the decision-making, but at the end of the day, we enter public service to serve others, and people were suffering. We had seen it. All of y'all had seen it, and this is the right model. This is a model that not only FEMA agrees, governor, our agency, to have an agency closer to the people administering these funds. So we did what we could. We staffed up. We transitioned our flagship of 538 full-time employees to the extent that they didn't have critical functions at the land office to support the FEMA mission. We co-located with FEMA at the Recovery Center at the old Gulfsmith corporate headquarters just north of the Capitol and got to work. And the fact remains that 10 months into the mission, we housed over 60,000 Texans, over 20,000 families through a combination of RVs, manufactured homes, trailers. So as Administrator had alluded to, we're working on a deep dive. We actually just put it out on our website in terms of recommendations moving forward. FEMA is confined by acts of Congress, and so we will be working with the Texas Congressional Delegation on some changes to make the process even better.
More than 890,000 Texans applied for aid through FEMA, and it was somewhere around 373,000 were approved. That 500,000, I mean, were those people that never should have applied? Why such a disparity between applications and approvals?
Sure, I think that's one thing that we're looking to address in our messaging for events is that not just apply, but if you have disaster-related damages, apply for federal assistance. And so applicants who are not approved, either through the questions they answered when they registered for assistance were not eligible, or through a site inspection, it was determined that they did not have eligible damages to receive assistance. So the ones who received the assistance, we have put out over $1.3 billion in individuals and households program. And those that did not, we do have an appeal process, so there is a way to adjudicate that denial if they feel like they were denied in error. And so we do issue appeal inspections based on additional information that a survivor may provide to us. And so that's how eligibility is determined and why we had so many registrations and then fewer actually approved for assistance.
How does that ratio compare to previous storms?
It's pretty average along the lines of previous storms, and we have in After Actions identified part of that is our messaging and making sure that we're extremely clear that everyone should not apply for FEMA. It's if you've had disaster-related damages that you should apply. But we have seen that that is fairly standard in events. Obviously, this was much larger and so much more impact across the state of Texas when you look at the square miles that were impacted. And so typically in the larger events or events that receive more media coverage, we see more people applying for FEMA assistance.
People that I've talked to that, had their homes damaged or destroyed, I mean, the common refrain is just your process and your application is just maddeningly, bureaucratically, just impossible to figure out. I mean, you even have officials, especially in the coastal bend, who, say that y'all don't communicate well with people on the ground, that people don't understand why they, get denied. They don't understand how to apply. And that they don't understand the appeals process. What you send out to people that I guess y'all would call an appeals letter, it reads like it's a denial letter to people. What have you learned from Harvey that y'all plan to change moving forward to make that easier for people who are under duress to go through that process and get help?
Sure. Some of the things that we're working on is one, streamlining our housing inspection process. That's one of our after actions from this event that we've established a working group and we'll actually be working with the state of Texas on that. We also are looking at, as you mentioned, the letters that go out to applicants. They can be extremely confusing and it's hard to understand that appeals process. So we are looking at revising those letters that go out to applicants as well. One thing I'll say that I think helped in this event is that our disaster survivor assistance team touched thousands and thousands of individuals in the communities one-on-one, and our DRCs saw a significant number of visitors, and that's where, if there's a misunderstanding, you have someone to go to who can help you, answer your questions, help you with an appeal, whatever it is that you may need. We had a significant number of disaster recovery centers open for a very long time for this event that could help survivors. But we do agree that, one, our housing inspection process needs to be streamlined. People in times of distress don't want to have one inspection, two inspections, three inspections, and all agencies do their own inspection, and then you have insurance inspections. So that's an area where I think not only federal agency, but our partners outside of the federal agencies who also do inspections, we need to work together to streamline that process to make it easier for the survivor. And then the letter, of course, I think is something that will be improving in the future to ensure that applicants understand exactly what they're either missing documentation or something like that, and it's not just strictly a denial, that there's not been a denial or an approval based on, in most cases, missing documentations or no site inspection.
Your agency sent on to Commissioner Bush's agency more than 86,000 people for the short-term housing programs. About 29,000, a little over 29,000 opted in. That 56,000 or so difference, why did those people who were approved not actually opt in?
There's a variety of reasons ranging from the programs, because there are different types of housing solutions offered to the constituent, ranging from direct repair to MHUs to RVs and trailers. I'd say, if I had to speculate, and the administrator can correct me on the after action report data, but I'd say half of it were folks that found another solution. Either they received their insurance proceeds, decided to pursue FEMA voucher program, which housed tens of thousands of families, which was, I think, the most benevolent policy that FEMA had, or the longest period of time that they've offered in any state jurisdiction. Others didn't like the contractors that came on site, because of the unscrupulous contractor issues that we saw in many jurisdictions. A lot said, hey, I don't trust you. So we worked on the verification process so that everybody was credentialed and tagged, so that when you came on site, the constituent didn't think that you were going to rip them off. There are a variety of other reasons that folks decided not to use those materials. They didn't like sometimes the construction materials that we offered for the PREPS program or the dollar program. They might have had different expectations. So among other recommendations that we have with FEMA, it's working on consolidating the PREPS program with the dollar program, which was offered to folks depending on the amount of FEMA verified loss that you had, so that we can manage expectations for the constituent, make it more customer serviced and more customer oriented for constituents.
Neither of your agencies know how many people are still displaced today. And when I asked last week, FEMA said you need to check with the GLO. GLO said you need to check with FEMA. Y'all are partners in this, but then, there's been a lot of times over the last year when I've, tried to nail down answers to questions and y'all have kind of passed to each other. On the question about how many people are still displaced today, why is that not something that either of your agencies would want to know?
Well, I could say, I guess, in terms of displaced, survivors who were eligible for a direct housing solution, who have been housed, and those that are left to be housed are just around 123, 4, 5 survivors who are remaining to be housed in that program. So considering that population, we are down just to over 100 people who have not had their housing solution finalized yet.
But that's people who've been approved for assistance and kind of gone through, hit all these hurdles, and that's what's left. I'm talking about the number of people who are actually don't have a permanent home, can't return to the home that they want to, people like that, the number of actual people who are displaced.
And I think that the reason why that's kind of a hard number to get to is because those that were eligible for the PREPS program, as you talked about, the what is initially the emergency sheltering program, where we do temporary repairs to a home to allow a survivor to get back into their home and finish their own repairs, permanent repairs. The General Land Office was able to complete, I think, over 15,000 homes in that program. So you have that program, then you have the housing program, which we're down to just 120-ish families. And then you have what was the Transitional Sheltering Assistance Program, which housed over 54,000 people in hotels. And when we came down to the end of that program and the number of people who were left with potentially no solution other than potentially family or friends or something like that, we have what's called a disaster case management program. That is also administered through the state, through the Health and Human Services Commission. And all of those left in TSA were assigned a case manager in that program to ensure that they were case managed out of TSA into a more permanent solution. And at the end of the TSA program, that number was extremely low. It was in the hundreds that were being case managed out. Otherwise, applicants who were not eligible for FEMA assistance, who could potentially be precariously housed prior to the event, or in another situation, we really don't have what I would consider a way in which to know what the current status is of those individuals because they did not fall into FEMA's individual assistance program.
Mr. Odum, so here we are in Houston a year after the storm. What is it that you're seeing on the ground, and what is the biggest need that the people of Houston need right at this point?
Well, I think the answer to that question really depends on, I'll give you my answer, but it depends on where you sit in the community, because it can be very different. To the conversation we were just having, you can drive through neighborhoods all over Houston and still get a sense for how many people are still displaced, because you see the empty homes, or in the worst case, you see somebody living in a home they shouldn't be living in. So there is still, and if you're in that position, if you're one of those individuals, your perspective on the pace of recovery and what's urgent now is different than what I'm going to tell you is my answer. But I want to recognize that that's out there, and that's a big part of what we all still need to deal with. I think if you sit in my chair, there's an immediate response element to the storm, and then there's the long-term picture. And I think to add to the conversation we were just having, it's important for everybody to recognize, I'm just talking about within the city of Houston, there's $4.3 billion that have hit the ground to help individuals through the FEMA programs and through the National Insurance Program and through SBA loans. So it's a massive effort, and that doesn't necessarily fix all the need that still exists there, but I think it's important to understand how much is actually happening. For the long-term picture, I actually feel reasonably good in most respects about where we're headed. Meaning our effort over the last year in particular has been about understanding what the need is out there, working through the system, because we work at a federal level, we work at a state level, of course, and then all that to bring things to a local execution. In terms of identifying the amount of money that's going to be here so that we know what we're dealing with and we can build and execute those programs very well, put the capacity in place to do that. I described to somebody once that if the city of Houston has $1 billion a year of discretionary spend, all of a sudden it's sitting on top of a $15 billion problem. You can't do that with the existing organization that you have now. So it's been a matter of building out that capacity and that capability so that we can execute. I feel good about that. I think when you this is, and there's lots of reasons for this, and I'm not pointing a finger anywhere when I say this, but when you think about the fact that the first big wave of funds that will come to Houston will be HUD funds directed towards housing. And I think on the fastest timeline from where we sit today, those would hit the ground in November, most likely. And we can't wait for them to get there. And I think we're pretty much ready to execute that program. But that's 14, 15 months after the storm. And I don't think any of us are, and I don't think any of us up here are or can be satisfied with that sort of pace. I mean, these are long-term dollars meant for long-term purposes, and there are reasons why it takes as long as it does, but I'm not going to miss the opportunity to make the pitch that with the right group of people together, this disaster recovery program that starts at a federal level could go through I think a fairly effective and quick redesign process, thinking about it from the federal level all the way down to the local homeowner, and be redesigned in a way where you could cut enormous amounts of time out of that process.
Why hasn't that been done before?
Well, I don't know. I can only, I
I mean, it's not the first hurricane to hit America.
No, I agree, but I'm going to answer that in a particular way because there's most of the questions I get about the storm and, why does Houston flood? Why didn't we fix this before? And, you can speculate a whole bunch looking back. It's more important to look forward. And I just see that as the opportunity that we have going forward. And I think it's, there's so much that happened. You think about what HUD and FEMA and certainly what's been going on with the commissioner and what's been happening in Texas, just the scale of what's been dealt with, not just Harvey, but Maria and the fires and the other floods in the country. I think, not only was Harvey a wake-up call for Houston and for Texas, I think the number of disasters and then the complications with capacity limitations and timelines, it's a call to order for all of us to do things differently going forward.
Would the three of you agree with that?
I would agree with that assessment. We, in our white paper that we just put up on our website, glo.texas.gov, one of our recommendations is to consolidate, at least as it relates to housing, consolidate the funds as they flow through federal entities downward. But Administrator touched on just one that could advance the housing mission quicker, and that's allowing Congress to allow agencies like ours to accept a FEMA environmental permit for a HUD permanent home reimbursement. So we're offering, Houston will administer their own program. We'll be directly administering $2.6 billion outside of Harris County, where money is already flowing into multifamily complex developments, rehabs, and reconstructs. But we still have to go through another environmental permitting stage because our HUD counterparts cannot accept a FEMA. So a lot of this requires will at the congressional level, and candidly to get them up the learning curve, particularly members of Congress not in a disaster area, requires a steep learning curve. But that's why, when things slow down, we hope to continue that advocacy, and we encourage people to check out our federal reforms that could help advance things.
Administrator Van Dyne, your agency is just kind of now starting to, be involved in the process, or be in charge of, the long-term recovery. Texas is getting $5 billion. Definitely there's another $89 billion that it will share with other states. People who haven't been helped or still have needs, what's the process for them to receive help with those funds?
So a couple of things. Texas is getting $10 billion between mitigation funds and CDBGDR to help primarily on housing. And we've been involved, actually, I want to say minus day 2. Even before the storms began, we were reaching out to county judges, to mayors, to as many, the governor's office, to as many of the emergency management personnel people, to let them know, okay, this is what happens once the storm hits. Because if you remember, we didn't know exactly where it was going to hit. We were still thinking it could be Austin, could be San Antonio. So reaching out to all those people to set up the process forward, and we've been working with FEMA again since day 1. It has been a complicated road. To Marvin's point, could we make it better? And the fact is, there's so many cooks in the kitchen, but which one do you kick out? Do you not work with the Army Corps? Do you not work with USDA that has, an ability to be able to bring funds to the table? What about SBA? There's HUD, there's FEMA, there's the GLO's office. We've got all of the county judges. We've got, at the local level. Who do you kick out? All of them want to have a say in what happens, and they should. From a federal perspective, what we look at is trying to empower at the most local level possible. You don't want, especially in Texas, you don't want, DC coming in and telling you what your recovery is going to look like. It's in our best interest to try to get that money at the local level as quickly as possible. You're talking about a spend of billions of dollars. And part of the reason why that takes so ridiculously long to figure out is there has to be long-term plans in place. Before you start spending millions and millions of dollars on, let's just say, infrastructure or houses, okay, are they going to have to be torn up? If you build the house before you have the road, will that make sense? What happens if you build the road but you've got all sorts of water problems and infrastructure underneath it? So you build it really quickly, and then you have to rip it up to be able to fix the infrastructure. So part of this is trying to empower every level to have a long-term plan in place, so that you know exactly what the damage is, how it's going to occur, and in what priorities those repairs have to take place. That takes a ridiculously long period of time. Part of what we tried to do early on was, before I worked with HUD, I was mayor for the city of Irving for 6 years, and I was on the city council for 6 years. So I recognize this as a local leader, from a local leader perspective. What would I do if this massive disaster happened to my house, to my city? And I had people coming up to me who were out of homes. City employees, by the way, who were out of homes, like in the city of Rockport. You had 28 people who came home that worked for the city, no longer had homes. What would I do in that situation? Houston is in an enviable position because they have a very deep bench of emergency management personnel. But in cities like Rockport, in Port Arthur, in Beaumont, in Newton, Texas, what are those folks going to do? And there was a little bit of panic and concern that all of the recovery funds were going to go to Houston. What about all of the other cities? And trust me when I say they are different. Houston is not like a Newton, which is a very large county, almost in Louisiana. It has 32,000 people. It is nothing like a Houston. So each of those areas, their recovery has to be personalized, and it has to be toward them. But early on, I thought, okay, there are so many different players and so many different pieces of the puzzle. How can we help organize that so that you're not having some of these smaller communities have to freak out, who am I calling and where do I call? If I call it FEMA, well, FEMA will tell me, well, that actually SBA has to help you with. And then okay, well, who do I call with SBA? So we put together a team, and it was about 22 of us who went into these communities directly. And we said, okay, at the same time that the General Land Office is coming up with its plan, and that HUD is reviewing those plans, at the same time that they're doing that, don't feel like you have to wait. Let's get your recovery plans on board right now, so that as soon as those funds are available, you have a plan that you're ready to apply, and we can get you started quickly. So we went down and the partners were included. FEMA was definitely there, the GLO's office, Rebuild Texas, SBA, USDA, the Army Corps. We had our philanthropic partners as well. As you know, those were hundreds of millions of dollars that were pledged to be able to help folks. But they needed to be directed. And so we went into these communities and we sat down with their planners and we said, tell us what your priorities are. You know, I've heard anywhere between 60 and 80 billion dollars of damage was done in Texas. We're not going to be able to provide that all in
Oh,
public.
that's way low.
Depends who you
It's
talk
over
to.
125 billion.
It depends who you talk to. And some of that was only for infrastructure, right? And didn't include housing numbers. But there's no way that that is all going to be covered by one source. So how can you leverage the different sources? And at the same time, it's kind of like when you drive out, you know, I'm from Irving. So if you drive out from Irving to Grand Prairie and you're going to Arlington, when you're driving, do you really care like what city limit you're in? Very similar. When you're working with the government, you really don't care if it's FEMA that's the problem, or HUD, or the GLO's office, or if it's a county issue. As somebody who's been damaged by the storm, who is trying to get your life back together, get your kids back to school, get back to work, none of that matters. And so I think what we have tried to do, we can always do a better job. We will never be perfect, and we were far from perfect in this example, but I think what we're trying to do is break through all of those different silos and work together as a very tight-knit group. I know Tony Harvey with FEMA, we had his cell phone number, Commissioner Bush, and whenever we needed each other, we called. Now, we were in the position, enviable position of being able to do that, but we're trying to help people at the most basic level get back to their lives. It's billions of dollars of spend in long-term planning. That does take time, and we're trying to cut through as fast as we can. Contingency and preparation are probably the best plans that we have of being able to decrease the number of months that takes.
This last question is going to be to each of you. And if you had one thing that the Texas congressional delegation could change, whether it be funding, whether it be creating a new law, whether it be repealing an existing law, one thing that could help you do your job better for the next storm, what would that one thing be that the Texas delegation could bring home from DC? And I'll just start with you.
Okay, well, I'm going to answer a slightly different question, but I think it applies to what you're asking. So one thing I think we have to look at ourselves first, and then we look to the state. And when I say ourselves, I mean regionally. And what we don't have that we really have to have is what I call a regional flood mitigation blueprint. So it's what you're hearing out of some of the groups represented by Rice and others, 22 watersheds in this area, a lot of different things where money could be applied to improve the situation, but what's not in place is a reasonably well-agreed set of plans for what should be done over the next 10, 20, and 30 years.
Regionally.
And it literally will take that long. Yeah, that's mainly, 22 watersheds that, mostly in Harris County, but it touches all the surrounding counties, and we have to think about coastal surge as well, so I include that in this blueprint. That putting that together, getting reasonable consensus around it, understanding the timelines, understanding the priorities associated with how we'd like to implement that. We have a tremendous start on it with the money that's coming now for flood mitigation. But having it in place so that we have this long-term guide for where we want to go, one of the key questions with all that is always, well, how do you fund it? I mean, who's going to pay for these various pieces? And I think with that in place, we can have a rational discussion with, how important is this area to the country? Therefore, where should some federal help come into paying for that blueprint? The same conversation with the state. So what I'd like to do is get that work done. Then I'd like to go to the state and say, this is where we think you ought to play in this picture over the long haul and seek agreement.
Commissioner, one thing?
I'll try and forward consolidated housing block grant. So if you just had a housing mission wrapped up in one state agency that could directly administer it. So repeating the phrase that you often heard in disaster areas, federally funded, state overseen, but locally led, we could reduce a lot of red tape and deliver assets quicker. Having said that, and if you look at the scope of Texas state history and disaster response, this has been faster, more effective. FEMA just came back with a no finding audit, so no abuse of taxpayer dollar. That's a good record, but we can get better.
Administrator?
Absolutely. We're definitely committed to trying to streamline our recovery and funding and programs as much as possible. And the federally funded state administered programs we think is the way to go, not only in housing, but potentially in state managed disasters as well. So we are certainly working, although we didn't get it in the last piece of legislation, the ability to do block grants under our 403 individual assistance program would alleviate us from having to do a contract with the state to administer housing. So with a block grant, we would be able to do similar to our public assistance program, which would be to give a block grant to the state to administer housing, which would potentially alleviate some of the bureaucracy that was that occurred in the program, because we are tied to following things like 2 CFR when it comes to federal procurements and contracting and other federal laws. So without that ability to do grant funding, we are moving down the path of the contract vehicle unless that changes in the future.
I would agree with everything that's been said, and I don't know if you can do this, if you can legislate this, but from a DC perspective, the more that Texas speaks with one voice, the easier it is to be able to administer funds. You know, sometimes what we saw was you have maybe a city fighting with a state, fighting with a county, and quite honestly, the best way to help folks is to be able to work with one voice, all have your eye on the same goal, and be able to vocalize that to be able to get the funding out quicker.
I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the audience and let y'all start asking your questions for the panelists. And if you could please ask a question and kind of get to the question fairly quickly. I understand if you need to set it up, but let's not go on for minutes at a time. And I'll go ahead and start with this gentleman right here.
Thank you guys so much for being here and sharing everything. Just in full disclosure, my name's Todd Litton, and I'm the Democratic nominee for Congress in the 2nd Congressional District, which looks like this. And so we have Kingwood, Cypress Creek, the Addicks Reservoir, Brays Bayou's in here, Buffalo Bayou too. So a lot of our area, as gerrymandered as it is, was impacted by Harvey and brought people together. I was curious in particular for Mr. Odum, you mentioned streamlining the disaster recovery process. And one idea I'm talking with folks about is having some kind of standing disaster recovery fund. That's something that we have. Disasters are more frequent and they're more severe. It takes so long for Congress to act at times, so that's the first question. The second to everybody is, I'm also talking with people about bringing back earmarks. Nobody wants a bridge to nowhere. We don't want to have earmarks that look like that. But how we can have targeted funding. The Ike Dike happened 10 years ago, Hurricane Ike, right? Nothing's been built there yet, right? I mean, we've talked a lot about this third reservoir, things like that. Earmarks, I think, could target these things, get them going a lot more quickly. Harris County and the region, I appreciate that, the regional perspective, is still under threat. So thanks so much.
And sorry, I'm only going to let you have the one because there's a lot of people on both
thanks.
sides. So, Mr. Odum.
Yeah, I would just say, so I think the idea of pre-staging, whether it's funding or it's other response kind of capability, is an excellent idea. And part of what could be a redesign of a system. Can I just say, we are absolutely blessed to have people like the other 3 folks here on the panelist. And when I say redesign, I just want to clarify, this is not a people problem, right? I don't run into any difficult people in this process. I run into a misshapen system that has just been built up over years and years and layers. So just want to make that clarification.
Thanks so much.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is Peter Ball, and I work with Keisha Rogers, who lost her parents a year ago today, being washed off a bridge out in the Fulshire area. And this kind of thing, Keisha's running for Congress in the 9th Congressional District here. And the question I want to pose to you is, in 1968, Governor Conley had a program to actually build the dams required in our watersheds. He had a plan for getting water out to West Texas. He didn't have a deep tunnel idea, but now that's becoming fairly usable. Chicago's done it, Washington, D.C. has done it, Tokyo's done it. But that's the level of thinking that rather than simply recovery, why don't we prevent? And it takes a big effort, but is there any discussion going on about actually solving the problem instead of mitigating it?
I'll go ahead and take a crack at that. One of our recommendations of our 18, and I feel like I'm plugging our report nonstop, is to strengthen the statutory authority of the Texas Water Development Board for exactly that reason. When you talk about the size of the river basins in Texas, the Brazos, the Trinity, my hometown of Fort Worth, 710 miles, but yet we have 12 different special purpose districts that govern that river basin. So we're under-equipped in terms of flood monitoring in the state of Texas. If we had, instead of another unfunded mandate, actual investment, we can potentially leverage some of the federal funding to do exactly that, so that there's better telemetry as we see a threat coming down river basin that, as we've seen, will impact the metro Houston area, would go a long way. Our agency actually continues to be involved, and we work with the Speed Center here on campus at Rice University for the development of a coastal spine idea, which was alluded to by the gentleman before, to also think about storm surge. So yes, Harvey was an incredible inundative event. In fact, when I went to school here, we had in the late 90s several flooding incidents as well, and over 40, I think, flooding federally declared disaster events in Texas since 1980. But at the same time, we need to think about storm surge. Speed Center's focused on looking at the economic activity of the Houston Ship Channel and what can we do to defend against that. So if there is a blessing from the congressional action after Harvey, they did expedite all of the Corps of Engineer studies that that the agency's partnered with on them. We don't have funding. We're working next session to get a state entity that can raise the right hand, similar to the Louisiana model, to be the state sponsor, the O&M partner with the federal government to actually start constructing it. Because you're right, it could be very well another study to the study, and people are tired of it in the greater Houston area, so let's get to work.
Hi, my name is Jacob Clementich, and this is about group housing. At any rate, I haven't, and I will be in group housing. At any rate, what I want to say is this. Rescuing people who are in group housing. See, I have a mental health issue, and that is I have what they have described as schizoaffective disorder. And, some of the residents that I'm with, besides having mental health issues, they also have criminal records. And so I was thinking, articles on taking care of people who have physical disabilities is well documented, but what about taking care of people in these major disasters who have mental health issues? I mean, how do we handle that?
Start. Jacob, maybe just if I could talk about it just very briefly, but in the context of housing, is what I want you to know is, as significant funding starts to come to this area, we're looking at that from a very comprehensive point of view, meaning it's not just about repairing houses that were damaged, it's about how do we improve the overall housing situation in Houston, and that's across the entire population, including the population that you described, so, and including the homeless population and a number of other particular groups that we need to pay attention to. So I just want you to know I don't have all the answers for you right here or the time, but we are working on it from that perspective.
It's a continuum of care issue as well. I mean, this is why we also had housing or our Health and Human Services at the table, because the detrimental effects after such a disaster happens have to be taken into account. Sometimes it's not just providing a house, but it's providing that continuum of care, mental support, emotional support, as well as financial support, and all of those people are at the table. But it's not just one agency, and it's obviously not just the money, but that is something that we have taken and we've prioritized.
And we have time for one or two more questions, but I understand the commissioner has to leave. He has to get to another event. If you want to, thank you for being here. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good
All right.
to see you.
Actually, my question was going to be for him, but maybe everybody else can get it. But real quickly, given that I'm Gary Scoggin, I'm with Galveston County Long-Term Recovery Group, and given that outside of Harris County, GLO is going to be administering the CDBG housing program, what are the experiences that you got from PREPS and Dollar that you're going to apply to maybe help that program, progress smoothly?
Well, PREPS, I think, was a smashing success. It's only been tried one time in American history, one time in Louisiana, if I'm not mistaken, Administrator. And it's a partial, just to be very clear, partial repair, essential power, sheltering program. So it's not meant to be a full, comprehensive housing solution. But we were able to identify many constituents very quickly. We're already working with Team Rubicon to be an immediate first responder group on our behalf. But it allows us to identify constituents for HUD-related programs, homeowner assistance programs, rental assistance programs, very early on after the process. So instead of having to hand the constituent case file from one agency to the next, we can maintain it, house it, and even keep that same relationship. So we think that it could be a potential model for the future. And again, of the $2.6 billion that we manage, $1 billion will be homeowner assistance programs. So a lot of the folks that either didn't qualify for a FEMA direct repair program or still qualify for additional federal funding can be a part of that program, and they apply first in time, first and right. But check out our website where we have more detail.
Thank you.
I have a question for Commissioner Bush as well before you go. My name is Miguel Suazo, and I'm your challenger on the November ballot. And I'd like to know how come you didn't stand up to Governor Abbott to tap the rainy day fund when there's still people here in Texas that are hurting, that are waiting for help, they haven't gotten it. And initially you came out saying that he should, and then he backed away from that. And we need that money now. We're Texans. We stand up for ourselves. We're independent. And yet we're still waiting on the federal government to give us the money that we need to recover. And you couldn't encourage the governor to tap that fund to get us the help that we need when we need it.
Yeah. Well, it's a request above my pay grade. I'm just your land commissioner. I think federal entities have done a great job getting funding down to agency like ours in terms of first response and search and rescue. And providing this historic response here in Texas. And we'll continue to do that. The legislature will visit the issue. A lot of agencies that have come out of pocket, so a lot of the programs that the federal government offers does require a local match. But as Administrator referred to, Newton County doesn't quite have an operating budget to meet that 10% or that 20% match. So we're tabulating that final bill. And once we get there, by the time we reconvene for legislative session in January of 19, we'll have a better figure as to whether or not we actually tap that rainy day fund, which is sitting north of $12 billion.
Are there any other questions? Yes, sir.
Name is Ray Gutierrez. I was in the drone when...
Do you want to step up to the microphone?
Get this off. Ray Gutierrez. We talked about a roadmap. There's a lot of entities that are always come to the table, but we don't have a specific roadmap of each individual entity and how they do it. I was in the rooms with Merrill when we were talking about Hurricane Ike. Worked with Robert Eccles and Rick Perry on the devastation. To this date, we still have a lot of issues, and we still haven't spent that money yet. Again, the federal government, all the agencies need to have a roadmap on how the young lady over there was talking about having one person follow the guidelines, making sure there's a spokesman. That's critical. But the other thing is to make sure there's a roadmap for each of the entities and a plan so everybody will know.
So the question being?
When are we going to have a roadmap?
So, well, I would argue that there's many roadmaps. I mean, and each department has a mission. But again, what's going to work in one community is not going to work necessarily in another community. There's not one size fits all solution. And a part of the problem is the time that it takes to figure out how much damages have happened. You know, that's something that FEMA does, and then you have to look at the local community. You have to look at the county, the state, before you get to the federal level. We all have a mission. Trust me, there are a number of plans. Not everything always goes as planned. What we try to do is communicate, make sure that we do know where our footprint is at all steps, but not let that prevent it, you know, the silos prevent us from communicating. And each of these disasters is unique. I mean, what's happening in Puerto Rico right now is much different than what's happening in California. And our response has to be flexible enough to be able to get to the needs of each individual and personalized solution. So we have the maps. we have to be flexible to change them depending on what the needs are.
I promise to have you all out of here by 1. It's 12:59. I want to thank our panelists for being here, and I want to thank all of y'all for coming. And thank you to Rice for having us.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brandon.
Thank you, sir. Yeah.